A polar bear crossed into the village at dawn. What it was trying to show them shocked everyone. The polar bear shouldn't have come into town, but she did, and nothing in Halvorsen would ever feel the same again. It started at 6:14 in the morning. Erik Sunde, 52 years old, 17 years driving the same salt-crusted plow truck along the same frozen stretch of Route 9, saw her first. He didn't honk, didn't brake hard. He simply stopped in the middle of the road, engine running, and stared at the rearview mirror until his breath fogged the glass completely. By the time he stepped out of the truck, 3 other people had already seen her. She was enormous. That was the first thing anyone said later. She was so much bigger than I expected. Nearly 9 feet from nose to tail, fur the color of old snow, yellowed at the edges like a page left in the sun too long. She moved without hurry, her massive paws pressing silently into the packed ice of Main Street. Each step deliberate, each breath visible in the Arctic dawn like smoke from something slowly burning. She was carrying something in her mouth, a wooden basket, the kind lined with wool and tied with cord, the kind mothers in Halvorsen used for everything from bread to laundry to sleeping infants on cold weather porches. Erik saw it and went completely still, because inside the basket, wrapped in pale blue fabric that moved just slightly as in the wind, was a baby. Doors closed along Main Street in sequence, like dominoes falling in slow motion. Curtain by curtain, face by face, the 43 permanent residents of Halvorsen, Norway, a fishing and research village pressed against the Svalbard coastline, retreated behind their windows and watched. Nobody screamed. That came later, people would say. At first there was only silence. The kind of silence that doesn't feel like quiet at all. It feels like pressure. Phones came out. Footage began. One woman called emergency services in Longyearbyen and kept the line open without speaking for nearly 4 minutes, just holding the phone toward the window. The local wildlife officer, Jonas Falk, 38 years old, former marine biologist turned one-man environmental patrol for the archipelago, received the alert at 6:21 a.m. He was already dressed. He lived 300 meters from Main Street and had heard nothing. Not a growl, not a footstep, not a single sound that didn't belong. That was the part that unsettled him most, even before he saw the footage. She hadn't come crashing through. She hadn't overturned anything, hadn't triggered a single motion light, hadn't left a visible trail until she was already in the center of town. She had simply appeared, and now she stood at the intersection of Main and Harbor Road, the basket still held between her jaws with a gentleness that made no biological sense, and she was not moving. The police dispatch issued a single instruction to every resident. Stay inside. Do not approach. Do not engage. No one needed to be told twice, except Jonas, who was already pulling on his jacket because someone had to go out there, and in Halvorsen, that someone was always him. He paused at his door, hand on the frame, watching her through the frosted glass. The bear looked up once, toward the coast, then back down at the basket. What do you do when the most dangerous animal in the Arctic is standing in the middle of your town, and it might be the only thing keeping a child alive? She had been gone 11 minutes. She knew because she had counted, the way mothers count everything, always, as if numbers can protect you. Her name was Lena Bergstrom and she was 26 years old, and she had done everything right. That was the thing she kept repeating to herself as she ran back across the frozen yard. I did everything right. The basket was the same one her mother had used. Heavy pine slats, wool lining, the cord tied in the same double knot she'd learned at 14. She had checked the temperature, -7, but no wind, no precipitation. She had layered Marta in the fleece onesie, the down sack, the outer wrap. She had set the basket on the porch bench against the wall, away from the ledge. She had looked back once before turning the corner toward the Hauge house. Marta had been sleeping. 11 minutes. That was all Lena had needed, to knock on Ingrid Hauge's door and tell her about the cracks she'd seen spreading along the ice shelf behind their row of houses since 4 a.m. And when she'd gotten up to feed the baby and noticed the sound, a low groan from the direction of the water, something structural giving way. She'd gone to check at first light, seen the fracture lines running like black veins across the pale surface, and known immediately that someone with a radio and more experience needed to know. Ingrid had opened the door before Lena finished knocking, listened, reached for her emergency radio, told Lena to go back to the baby. 11 minutes. The porch bench was empty. Lena stood at the bottom of the steps and stared at the place where the basket had been. The wool blanket was still there, one corner of it pinned under the leg of the bench, the rest of it trailing off the side like something had been lifted away mid-motion. She picked up the blanket and held it. It was still warm from Marta's body. That warmth was the worst thing she had ever felt in her life. She didn't scream immediately. There was a moment, perhaps 3 seconds, where her mind simply refused. It ran the sequence backward. Basket on bench, cord tied, Marta sleeping, temperature stable, no wind. None of the math allowed for this outcome, so her brain tried the equation again and again, arriving at the same impossible answer each time, until her body made the decision her mind couldn't, and she dropped the blanket and screamed her daughter's name into the Arctic morning and heard nothing come back. She checked under the porch, around the side of the house. She looked at the ground for footprints, human ones, and found none. What she found instead, just past the fence line, pressed deep into the packed snow, were 4 marks she recognized immediately from the warning posters inside the research station. Round, wide, 5 toes, each one the size of a dinner plate. The tracks led north toward Main Street, and they did not hurry. Whatever had made them had walked at a steady, even pace, carrying its weight and Marta's, with complete calm, as if it had all the time in the world. Lena followed the tracks for 30 seconds before Ingrid caught up to her, grabbed her arm, and pulled her back inside. Her phone was already ringing. Jonas Falk's number on the screen. In the background, through the still morning air, Halverson's one emergency siren had begun to wail, and somewhere on Main Street, a baby was not crying. That silence, that terrible, unreadable silence, was the thing Lena would never fully explain to anyone who asked her about that morning. Not the tracks, not the empty bench, not even the warmth of the blanket still in her hands. It was the silence, because it meant Marta was either perfectly fine, or it meant something else entirely. And between those two possibilities, there was nothing to hold on to, nothing at all. On the other side of town, Jonas Falk was already moving, and he had just seen, on the grainy feed of someone's doorbell camera, the bear lower her head slowly over the basket, as if checking on something. Nobody who watched the footage that morning could agree on what they were seeing. Not because the image was unclear. Jonas had pulled 3 separate feeds by then, 2 doorbell cameras and the mounted lens above the harbor supply office, but because what the bear was doing refused to fit inside any category they had for bears, for any animal. She was sitting, not crouched, not poised to move, sitting the way a dog sits when it has decided the walk is over and it is time to go home. Weight back, spine upright, front paws flat on the ice. The basket rested between those paws. She had not dropped it. She had set it down with the same deliberate care you'd use placing something fragile on a shelf, and now she simply held her position at the intersection of Main and Harbor Road, her breath rising and falling in slow visible plumes, her amber eyes moving at regular intervals between the basket and the waterline 200 meters to the north. Jonas watched this on his phone screen while pulling on his second boot. He watched it 3 times. Then he called Dr. Annika Solberg at the research station. She picked up on the first ring, which meant she was already awake, which meant she had already seen it. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Outside, the siren had gone quiet. The village had gone very, very still. The bite pattern, Annika said finally. Look at the basket. He zoomed in on the feed. The wooden slats were intact. No splintering, no compression fractures, no visible damage to the cord or the lining. In a jaw capable of crushing a seal's skull, the basket looked untouched. Maternal carry, Annika said. It's identical. The grip position, the neck angle, the way she holds the weight forward. It's exactly how they transport cubs. I've documented it for 6 years, and I've never seen it look like anything else. Jonas didn't answer right away. He was already out the door, moving slowly up the street, staying close to the building faces, keeping himself small. That doesn't make her safe, he said. No, Annika agreed. It makes her consistent, which is not the same thing. He understood what she meant. A bear acting on instinct is predictable only until the instinct is disrupted. The wrong sound, a sudden movement, a smell that didn't belong. Any of those things could collapse the behavior in under a second, and there would be nothing in between. No warning, no transition, no negotiation, just the shift from one state to the other. The baby was still not making a sound. That detail had moved from alarming to unbearable in the space of the last 20 minutes. Jonas had been told, by Ingrid Hauge over the phone, that the child was 4 months old, healthy, had been fed at roughly 4:30 a.m., and had gone back to sleep without difficulty. A sleeping infant, well-fed, warmly wrapped in a sheltered basket, possibly still asleep, possibly not. He stopped at the corner of Merchant Street, pressed his back against the post office wall, and looked. She was 40 meters away, bigger than she'd seemed on the screen. They always were, in person, as if the camera borrowed size from them and kept it. Her coat was the pale yellow-white of old bone, darkened at the muzzle and along the lower legs, worn thin at the shoulders in a way that suggested age and long seasons. One ear had a small notch near the tip, a scar, perhaps, or an old freeze injury. Her eyes, when they moved slowly and with purpose. She was not agitated. She was not scanning for threats. She was watching the coast the way you watch something you have already accepted you cannot change. Jonas had been doing this job for 11 years. He had tranquilized bears, tracked bears, tagged bears, filed incident reports on bears. He had never stood this close to one that was not sedated or in motion. He had never seen one look like this. Not dangerous, not docile, waiting for what he didn't know yet. But the answer he was beginning to understand was somewhere out there on the ice, in the direction she kept looking, in the place she had come from before the sun rose over Halverson and changed everything. Jonas had a rule about drones. Never send one unless you're prepared for what it finds. He sent it anyway. The department's quadcopter was small, cold weather rated, nearly silent at altitude. He launched it from the alley behind the post office while Annika patched into the live feed from the research station. The bear did not react to the sound. She didn't even look up. That alone told him something. She was accustomed to the noise, or she was too focused on whatever held her attention to register anything else. He pushed the drone north, following the coastline. The ice shelf behind the residential row was worse than the reports had suggested. What Lena Bergstrom had seen at 4 a.m. The fracture lines, the dark veins, had widened considerably in the hours since. Two sections had already separated and were drifting slowly, turning in the current like pieces of a broken mirror. The water between them was black and flat, and absorbed the morning light without giving any back. Jonas moved the drone lower. Annika saw it first. She didn't say anything for a moment, and the silence on the line was its own kind of answer. "Stop there," she said. He held the drone steady. On the feed, partially submerged against the base of a fractured ice shelf, caught in the angle where two broken slabs had come back together, was the body of a polar bear cub. Small, very small, perhaps 6 or 8 weeks old. The white coat had gone gray-blue in the water. One of the slabs had shifted over it in a way that suggested the cub had been there for some time, pinned by the movement of the ice rather than placed. There were older tracks on the intact shelf nearby, large ones. A circular pattern, back and forth, worn into the surface the way tracks get worn when an animal has been returning to the same spot repeatedly over hours, maybe days. She had been coming back. Jonas lowered the drone another meter and looked at the area around the cub. The ice shelf showed signs of disturbance, deep gouge marks, a wide displaced section, consistent with a struggle, or with something falling through unexpectedly, or with an attack. The marks were large and overlapping and told a story he couldn't read completely, but the broad shape of it was clear enough. The cub had not survived whatever had happened out here. He pulled the drone back and held it above the waterline, looking south toward town, and there she was in the frame, a white shape at the end of Main Street, motionless, the basket still between her paws. From this height and distance she looked small, patient, entirely alone. Jonas cut the feed and stood in the alley for a long moment with the controller in his hands. Annika spoke quietly. She lost it recently, 2-3 days at most based on the condition, and then this morning she comes into town and she finds a basket, he said. Wool lining, warmth, the smell of milk and skin. Annika paused. Her nervous system wouldn't have asked permission. It would have just responded. He understood. Grief, in bears, was not abstract. It was chemical, physical, written directly into the body. A mother who had lost a cub that size was not grieving the way humans understand grief, as something carried internally, processed over time. She was carrying an absence that her instincts could not categorize. Every signal in her biology was still oriented toward something that no longer existed. And then, at dawn, something had given those signals an answer. She hadn't come into Halverson to hunt. She hadn't come looking for food or territory or anything that the warning posters described. She had been moving along the coast, the way she had been moving for days, returning to the same broken patch of ice, and somewhere in that circuit she had crossed behind the row of houses on Fjordvegen Street, and caught a scent that her body recognized before her mind could question it. She had picked up the basket the way she would have picked up her own cub, carefully, completely, without hesitation, and she had carried it to the center of the village and sat down, and she was still sitting there. Jonas started walking back toward Main Street. He moved slowly, deliberately, giving her every chance to hear him coming. In his left hand he carried the radio. In his right, a piece of frozen seal meat from the emergency kit in his truck. Not enough to distract a bear that size for long, but enough perhaps for a moment. One moment was all he needed. He just had to get close enough without breaking whatever fragile thing was holding this situation together. Behind him, somewhere deeper in the village, he could hear Lena Bergstrom's voice. Not words, just the sound of it, raw and continuous. The kind of sound a person makes when they are being held back from somewhere they need to be. He walked faster. Jonas had 32 meters left when she looked at him. Not the slow, periodic glance she'd been giving the coastline all morning. This was direct, immediate. Her head came up and her eyes found him the way a compass needle finds north, without searching, without adjustment, as if she had known exactly where he was the entire time and had simply been waiting for him to get close enough to address. He stopped. The rule in every training he'd ever done was the same. Do not freeze, do not run, do not make yourself appear larger or smaller than you are. Stand your ground. Speak calmly. Give the animal a clear path away from you and do not block it. He had taught this to others. He had written it into briefing documents. He had said it so many times the words had become automatic, emptied of meaning through repetition. Standing 40 meters from a 900-pound bear with a baby between her paws, the words came back to him with complete and original force. He spoke first, low even, no particular content, just sound, just the signal of a human presence that was not hiding and not threatening. She watched him. Her ears, which had been relaxed and slightly back, moved forward, listening, processing. He had been told once by a researcher who had spent 15 years in the field that bears make decisions the way rivers find channels, not through reasoning, but through the accumulated pressure of everything in front of them. You could not argue with a bear. You could only change the landscape. He took one slow step forward and crouched down, making himself smaller without sitting, keeping his weight forward, mobile. With his left hand he placed the piece of frozen meat on the ice and slid it toward her. Not at her, not a throw, just a slow push along the surface that stopped well short of where she was sitting. She looked at it, then back at him, then down at the basket. That pause, 3 seconds, maybe 4, was the longest Jonas had ever experienced in a single unit of time. He was aware of everything inside it, the sound of his own pulse, the faint creak of the ice under his boots, the absolute silence of the village behind him, 43 people holding a collective breath behind 43 windows. He was aware of the basket, and of the stillness inside it, and of what that stillness might mean. He was aware of her breathing, which had not changed. Slow, deep, visible in the cold air. A body at rest, not at threat. She looked at the meat again. Then she stood. It happened in a single fluid motion. All that mass organizing itself upward without effort, without sound, the way water rises. She was fully upright for just a moment, looking at him from her full height, and Jonas did not move, and did not look away, and did not allow himself to calculate the distance between where she was and where he was, because that calculation would not help him. She lowered her head, took one step back, then another. She did not take the meat. She left it exactly where it had come to rest on the ice, and she backed away from the basket in a straight line, her eyes still on Jonas, her movement unhurried and deliberate, the way you leave a room when you have decided to leave rather than when you have been forced out. There was a dignity to it that Jonas had no language for and would spend a long time trying to find. At 5 meters she stopped and looked at the basket one final time. That look lasted less than a second. Jonas could not have described it if asked. He would try later for the report and for the journalist who called from Oslo, and for his sister who asked him over the phone that night, and each time the words would come out wrong. Too small, too certain, too human. The look was none of those things. It was simply what it was. An animal regarding something it was leaving behind. Then she turned north. Jonas was already moving. He covered the distance to the basket in 8 steps, crouched, pulled it toward him with both hands and looked inside. Marta Bergstrom was awake. She was not crying. She was lying on her back in the wool lining, arms loose at her sides, eyes open and tracking the pale morning sky above her with the vague, unfocused interest of a 4-month-old, confronted with something too large and bright to process. Her color was good. Her breathing was even. She smelled of cold air and lanolin and the faint animal warmth that had surrounded her for the last 40 minutes. She looked up at Jonas and blinked. He exhaled for what felt like the first time in an hour. Behind him, from the direction of Fjordvegen Street, he heard running footsteps. One set, fast and reckless on the ice, the kind of running that doesn't calculate risk. He turned and saw Lena Bergstrom coming around the corner with nothing on her feet except wool socks, her coat half-buttoned, her face a map of every second of the last 40 minutes. He held the basket out toward her and said her daughter's name. Lena didn't slow down. She came straight to him and took Marta out of the basket in one motion and pressed her against her chest and bent over her and made a sound that had no name in any language, the sound of a relief so total it briefly resembles grief. Jonas stood up and looked north. The bear was still visible, moving along the ice shelf at the same even pace she'd used to enter the village, getting smaller. The morning light had shifted in the last hour, coming in lower and colder off the water, and in it her coat looked less yellow, more white, the white of the ice itself, of the horizon, of the point where the land ends and everything becomes indistinguishable. She did not look back. 3 weeks later, the Norwegian Institute of Wildlife Management released a 4-page report on the Halvorsen incident. It used words like aberrant proximity behavior and stress-induced maternal displacement and non-aggressive human-wildlife contact event. It concluded that the bear, designated female, estimated age 11 to 14 years, no existing tag or tracking record, had likely been drawn into the village perimeter by olfactory stimuli consistent with an infant, following recent cub loss, and had exhibited carrying behavior typical of maternal transport, before voluntarily withdrawing upon human intervention. The report did not use the word grief. It did not use the word choice. It was a careful document, written by careful people, and every sentence in it was technically accurate. Jonas read it twice, signed the acknowledgement form, and filed it in the bottom drawer of his desk. Lena read a summary of it online, late at night, while Marta slept in the room next to hers. She read it the way you read something that describes an experience you lived, looking for the part where it matches, finding the outline of the shape, but not the weight of it. She closed the tab and did not go back. The basket was in the closet now. She hadn't thrown it away. She hadn't decided what to do with it. It sat on the shelf next to the extra blankets with the cord still knotted the way she'd left it that morning, the wool lining permanently holding a faint smell she couldn't name and hadn't tried to. Marta, for her part, had no record of any of it. She had been too young. In 10 years, in 20, someone would tell her the story, and she would have no memory to confirm or contradict it. She would only have the telling. That bothered Lena more than she expected. Not the not knowing, the fact that the most significant morning of Marta's life would exist for her only as something that happened to someone else. Eric Sunda still stopped his truck at the same point on Route 9 each morning, out of habit or something he didn't examine closely. He never saw anything. The road was always empty, but he looked, every time, before accelerating. Ingrid Hauge had the drone footage saved to an external drive she kept in her kitchen drawer. She had watched it perhaps a dozen times. Not obsessively, she told herself, just periodically. There was a moment in the footage, 18 seconds in, where the bear lowered her head over the basket and held that position for almost 4 full seconds before raising it again. Ingrid had paused on that frame more than once. She was a practical woman who did not believe in projection, who had spent 30 years in a place where nature was large and indifferent and did not arrange itself around human meaning. She still couldn't watch that 4 seconds without her chest doing something she had no name for. The ice shelf behind Fjordvegen Street was fully repaired by early spring, new formations closing the fractures, the surface smoothing over as if the break had never happened. The drones had gone back out twice in the weeks following the incident, per protocol, scanning the coastline for the bear. They found tracks on 2 occasions, both times heading northwest, away from the village. The second set were recorded 11 days after the incident, nearly 40 kilometers out. After that, nothing. She was not tagged. She was not monitored. She moved through the landscape the way everything up there moves, without permission, without record, leaving only what the ice chose to hold and surrendering the rest to the water. Jonas thought about her sometimes, on the long winter patrols when the coastline was dark by 3 in the afternoon, and the only sound was the wind off the strait and his own footsteps on the packed snow. He thought about the look she'd given the basket before she turned away. He thought about the tracks on the ice shelf, that circular returning pattern worn into the surface over days. He had 11 years of field experience. He knew what anthropomorphism was and why it was a problem. He knew that behavior had mechanisms, that instinct was chemistry, that the gap between animal experience and human interpretation was real and wide, and not to be collapsed casually. He also knew what he had seen. He had never been able to make those two things sit comfortably in the same room. He suspected he never would. He had stopped trying. Marta Bergstrom turned 5 months old on a Tuesday in late February. Lena took a photograph of her on the same porch in the same light, bundled in the same down sack. She did not put her in the basket. She held her herself close and did not look away, and did not count the minutes. Outside, the Arctic was quiet. The ice held. The horizon, as always, gave nothing back. What do you think she was carrying that morning? And what do you think she left behind? Your participation means a lot to the channel. Please share your thoughts in the comments.